Welcome back from the break. In Module 2, we'll explore the services and identity types of Azure Active Directory, along with the capabilities of Azure Active Directory, including authentication, access management, and identity protection and governance. Let's get started with Module 2. This module is broken into 4 lessons. We'll start looking at service and identity types in Azure Active Directory, then moving on to authentication capabilities of Azure Active Directory, and then access management capabilities, and finally talking about identity protection governance capabilities in Azure Active Directory. So let's make a start with the first lesson, looking at the services and identity types in Azure Active Directory. So in this lesson, we'll talk about what is Azure Active Directory and talk about different identity types we have in Azure Active Directory. Microsoft Entra is our new product family that covers all Microsoft Identity and Access Management solutions, including Azure Active Directory. Now, Azure Active Directory is a cloud-based identity and access management service, which allows organizations to enable their users, such as employees, staff, guests, and partners, to sign in and access the resources that they need, which can be internal or external. It provides you a single identity that can be used on the cloud or on premises, and it has advanced features that can help you protect your identity and credentials that can also help you meet your governance requirements. Now, if you already have any of these products in your organization, things like M365, Office 365, Azure, Dynamics 365, online subscriptions, then you automatically have Azure Active Directory tenant running in the background. Azure has different identity types. Typically, we can talk about users, which has an identity which is simply representing an individual's identity in an environment, which is same in on-premises and on Azure Active Directory. But we can also use devices. Now, any hardware can be part of the Azure Active Directory. This can be your laptops, your mobile devices, your printers, your servers, and they can be given identities that can determine how these devices should work and who owns them. We have something different, which is called service principal. Now, service principal is an identity that is provided to an application. You are now able to identify an application with its own identity that can be used to allow the application access to other resources or users to access these applications. We also talk about managed identities. Now, managed identities allow you to work with your applications to give access or authenticate them so they can access different services. When you're connecting with services in Azure environment, your applications are able to now authenticate themselves directly rather than a user authenticating themselves using the application to access a service. For instance, an application accessing a database. It does no longer need details provided by the user to authenticate itself. An application can use its own identity to authenticate itself. With managed identities, you have 2 types. You have system-assigned managed identity and user-assigned managed identity. With system-assigned managed identities, you have services that can be enabled to allow managed identities, and when you create a resource in Azure, they automatically create a managed identity or system-assigned identity for that service, which is bound to the lifecycle of the resource. For example, you create a virtual machine, the identity that's assigned to this virtual machine can last with the virtual machine. When you get rid of this virtual machine, the identity is deleted. A user-assigned identity works slightly different and is independent or a standalone. So when you create a user-assigned managed identity, it has to be associated to different services in Azure, and once you delete those resources, your identity does not get deleted. You have to manage that yourself. Now let's have a look at Azure Active Directory and look at users settings in Azure Active Directory. Let's look into Azure Active Directory on the portal. Now if I log into my portal.azure.com, if I go through my menu blade on the side, I can see Azure Active Directory here. Now let's go into Azure Active Directory and look at the Azure Active Directory menu. Now I am in Azure Active Directory Blade and I have quite a few options to look at in this blade. We are interested to look at the users for now, so let's go into the users and explore the users really quick. Now I already have a few users created. Looking at them at a quick glance, I can get information about different users and what these users' settings are or users' details are within the overview menu. I can see this particular user, let's assume Adele. Adele in this case is got her email, her account details, and she's a member of my organization. So she's a staff member. If she was an external user, you would get to see that over here as an external user. I'll talk more about that as we move along. If this was synced with my on-premises environment, this would be visible here to say yes, that this user is external or from on-premises synced onto Azure Active Directory. Now if I wanted to create a new user, I simply click on create new user, and this will allow me to create new users by simply providing details. For example, the username that I want to keep for that user, and this can vary depending on your organization. You might use first few letters of first name, some method that your organization allows, or first name dot surname, and that could also work for some organizations. And you can provide some details into this, and you should be able to create a username very quickly. Now let's quickly go into one of the users and have a look at some of the settings for this user. At a quick glance, I can see that this user is a member of my organization, and I can see what this user is doing in terms of group members. This user has 17 groups that is associated with, and some of the details like their applications and signed in licenses. Now I could simply go into checking if there are any roles assigned to this user by clicking on assign roles, and I could see if there are any roles assigned. If I wanted to assign a role, I'll click on add role assignment and we can add roles. We'll discuss roles a bit later today. We can also look at groups, and again, like I said, this user is a member of quite a few groups. We can add or remove or manage them from this menu within my user blade. Azure Active Directory allows us to collaborate with external users and manage their identities within Azure Active Directory. Now this can be done in two different ways. We can collaborate with partners that we work with using B2B collaboration options. This allows us to create users within our Azure Active Directory tree and create user accounts for them or send an invitation to them. Part of this invitation would mean that they can use their own account and their own details that they currently hold. The beauty of this is if you have a contractor that's coming to collaborate with you, and if this contractor works with quite a few other organizations, they don't have to remember all different username and passwords of different companies they work with. Simply because after working for a few organizations, they might not remember all the username and passwords, and this will end up in them writing them down, which can be a security threat. So this makes that easier to create a user account within your Azure Active Directory tree and create a B2B account, which appears up on your Azure Active Directory as external account, not as a member. And with their name, regardless of what service they're using, such as Teams or other services, they'll see external written next to the name within a bracket. So other users can identify them as external users within working or collaborating with you in your organization. We also have another feature called B2C. This allows you to collaborate with users or end users or clients that you want to ensure that they can authenticate themselves before they work with your services. Things like running applications. Maybe you want to launch an application and you want your clients to log into this application, but authenticating themselves so you know they are genuine users. Instead of managing their accounts, you could allow them to use their own existing accounts, things like their social media accounts from Google, Facebook, or LinkedIn that they can utilize to log in. These are managed in a separate directory tree in Azure Active Directory. If you're using on-premises environments and you're not completely migrated to Azure and you're still in process of migrating, then your organization is in a hybrid environment. Now, organizations can choose to be in a hybrid environment for various reasons. Like I mentioned, you might be in a transition period and moving into the cloud, or you might have some services that cannot be moved to the cloud for various different reasons. Could be governance or compliance, or any other legislations that can enforce you to keep that service, those services or data locally onto your environment. So for that reason, you might be in a hybrid environment. That simply means that you can still use your on-premises environment and Azure accounts and services with a single account. You can do this with a use of a tool called Azure Active Directory Connect, which allows you to connect your Azure Active Directory services to your on-premises account. Now, during this process, you have 3 different mechanisms of authenticating your users when they're logging into services. It all comes down to what kind of a security service that you want to implement. You could use password hash sync, which allows you to use the hash or password hash to sync with your Azure Active Directory and just authenticate that online. So this authentication happens in Azure in the cloud. You could use pass-through authentication, which means that any authentication method that's happening either in the cloud would then be pushed down to your Active Directory on premises to authenticate. That means authentication happens on your premises. Or finally, you could use a federated service where you could hand over the authentication process to a third party or a specialized service to handle the authentication for you. Typically, Azure Directory Federation Services could handle that for you on premises as well. Let's look at lesson number 2. Here we will talk about authentication capabilities of Azure Active Directory. Now, within this lesson, we'll talk about authentication methods, and we'll look at multi-factor authentication and password protection and management capabilities of Azure Active Directory. Let's have a look at different authentication methods. Now, passwords has been a primary method of authentication for a very long time, and we still utilize this as one of the forms of authentication. Typically, people tend to have multiple passwords for different services. I'm hoping they do. And with that comes the difficulty of remembering too many passwords. People then tend to rely on easy passwords, so it's easier for them to remember, and they comes with a problem. Your malicious actors or users can utilize different tools that can guess easy passwords. If you make the passwords complex, it gets difficult for people to remember them, and especially when there are lengthy passwords, they're not easily remembered. What we can do, you can use secondary methods to allow you to authenticate yourself to different services by using a device that you may hold. For instance, you try to log in and you are then prompted to respond to a message that is sent out using SMS or a voice command call that's dialed in onto that device that you would hold, and that would ask you to verify by using a code or a PIN to ensure that it's you. And that could be a better way of logging into the services. We do have other options that are considered even better than using your personal device. Things like using open auth protocols that can allow you to connect to services, using Microsoft Authenticator app that can allow you to authenticate yourself every time you log into a secure site or a service. Apart from that, you can generate software or hardware tokens. These can generate one-time access or one-time passcode that you can use to log in, and they expire out after a certain period of time. For example, generating a code for 30 seconds to a minute, and once you log in, it will then expire, or if you don't use that code, it expires after that time period. Similarly, a lot of the organizations use hardware tokens. This can be anything like RSA token, hardware key, that can generate a code every time you tap it, and it then lasts for a particular time period. Now, obviously, these would have to be registered against your account, and you can generate these codes when you need to log in and authenticate yourself. We do have best ways to, or better ways than all of these, to log into some of your services and to authenticate yourself by using passwordless features. We have Microsoft Hello, that allows you to log into your device and authenticate you on your local device as you log in. Now, sometimes I get asked, why do you think this is the best method to log in or authenticate yourself? Simply because this service authenticates me onto a local device by using my facial recognition, a PIN, and once it logs me in, it doesn't ask me for any authentication username and password for any services that are associated with my accounts. In this way, my password or my authentication happens based on a hardware that's on a temporary platform module or TPM chip that's on my hardware, and it doesn't leave anywhere, which is not easily affected by malicious actors or users to make changes to my details or steal them from my TPM chip. So it makes it more secure for me to use that and authenticate myself to different services. You could still use Authenticator app to log in without password. You can use your thumbprints or facial recognition on these apps, and that can authenticate your access, which can be a secondary form of authentication on some of these. And finally, you can use fast identity online services that can be used as a USB keys that you can plug in or remove from the devices to allow you to access. And as soon as you plug them in, they log you into a service, and as soon as you plug them out, you disconnect from that particular service. We can also use multi-factor authentication along with our services. Now, we did mention about different authentication methods. Now, some of those were primary and secondary methods. That kind of talks about multi-factor authentication. We want to use more than one way of authenticating ourselves just to make sure that a user that's trying to log in is challenged enough to ensure it is them or who they say they are. To do this, we use multi-factor authentication. Now, multi-factor authentication relies on three main areas. One of them talks about something you know. And typically, this is what we spoke about in terms of passwords, PINs, or memorable words that you're aware of. Apart from that, you would also want to have an understanding of something that you could have. And here we spoke about having a mobile device, maybe other things like smart card and something similar that could help you to identify who you are. Maybe an identity card, smart card, that could also work. A digital token could also be part of that. Finally, we want to ensure that we have something that you are. Basically, this is identifying an individual using their biometrics. It could be a voice recognition, facial recognition, thumbprint or fingerprint scans. So any of those put together in a mix to ensure that we can have a strong challenged user that is trying to log into a service, to authenticate them and then authorize them to do the task that they're willing to complete. Typically, when you're asked to look at multi-factor authentication, using a mix of two or more of these options is what we're looking to do. We don't want you to start looking at using two or more challenges of same type. So we don't want you to be asked with password and PIN as a authentication method, because that's something you know, and both of them are of something you know type. So you would want to do a bit of a mix. Maybe something you know, so you start off with your password, and in return it asks you to then verify. Once your password has been accepted, it wants you to verify by using your Authenticator app on your phone. Now, for you to log into the Authenticator app, you might have to unlock the app by using your thumbprint, so that's something that you are. Once you get into the Authenticator app, you can accept that request that's been sent, and by accepting that, you are doing something or you are utilizing something you have, and that is to ensure that you have that mobile device to authenticate that connection. Now, Microsoft Active Directory or Azure Active Directory automatically allows you to use security default features. Now, these features are there to implement for those who are new to Azure Active Directory or just about setting up Azure Active Directory, but want to ensure that they have some security features in place before they start working with their services. Or for those who are new and want to ensure that they have at least some sort of security implemented and have better security posture across different services running in Azure environment. By enabling security default, you are automatically enforcing all the users to use multi-factor authentication on their services. Organizations that are using complicated or premium licensing would require to use their own security settings. Security defaults are there for those who are either new to Azure Active Directory or might be using a free tier of Azure Active Directory, and by default they can enable them to secure their environment. It is all good to use some of these features that we speak about in terms of password and passwordless features, which are nice for us to log into services without using the password. But it comes with a little bit of a caveat, and that is that when you're not using your password for a long period of time, very likely you are to forget your password. For instance, I'll use my laptop to log in to my services. I'm using Microsoft Hello to log in, and I'm only using my facial recognition. Let's assume my organization has a policy that every 60 days to 90 days I need to reset my password, or if I am traveling to a different site and they want me to type in my password to log into a service. In that case, if I don't remember my password because I've been using my facial recognition to log in, I might forget my password. And this can happen very frequently and increase a lot of requests for your admin staff or IT staff to reset user passwords. For that reason, there is an amazing feature that's available in Azure Active Directory called SSPR, which stands for Self-Service Password Reset, which means you can use the service to allow users to reset their passwords. Now I know what you're thinking. This might be a security risk, simply because if someone can reset their password, what's that stopping from others or malicious actors to resetting someone's password to access their account? For that reason, there are different mechanisms that you can set in place on how you can ensure it is a genuine user that's trying to reset their password, so you can challenge them with different methods that we can have a look at. Now, why would somebody want to reset their password apart from forgetting their password? Maybe I don't like my password, or I think it's been compromised and I want to reset my password for my services, including Azure Active Directory. So I might want to change my password, not just reset it because I've forgotten it. Or maybe my account is locked out and I want to go back and unlock my account because I've tried in too many sign-in attempts, or for whatever reason I haven't used my account for a month or two and my account is locked out. So all these reasons I can use self-service password reset to reset my account. Now let's have a quick look at how this looks like in the portal. I'm back in my portal, and if I go back into Azure Active Directory and go through the blade that is on Azure Active Directory and scroll down under Manage, I can scroll down to look at passwords. There we go, password reset. Only if I can spot it quickly. All right, under password reset, just to highlight some of the options I have over here, I can see that I have an option over here that says self-service password reset enabled. Now, typically, if you haven't enabled this feature, it will not be on selected or all. It should be looking at none. Now, is a guideline that if you are using Azure Active Directory, maybe it's a very good feature to implement to avoid too many tickets coming into your admin staff or IT staff to reset passwords. So you can choose to enable this for your entire organization by clicking on all. Or if you don't decide to switch this on for all users, you may choose to select a few users that you want to allow to reset their password for whatever reason. Now, to do this, one important information to remember is that within this setting, you can only add one group to reset password. So you can't add multiple groups. So ensure that you can go and create a new group and make all the users that you want to allow to reset their password as a member of that group. And once you are happy with that, you can come here and search that group and add that group. For example, I've added SSPR security group users, which are allowed to reset their password. And within that group, I have a set of users that can reset their password. Now, again, It's advisable to select enable that for all, not necessarily selected users, but different administrators might decide to do things differently. Well, let's talk about authentication methods. Now, these are methods that users would use to reset their passwords, and we want to ensure that we can make this challenge a bit difficult for those who are malicious actors and trying to access this service. I can choose number of methods to reset, 1 or 2, so maybe I want them to do 2 different things when they're trying to reset. And what I can choose from is a long list of options that I have here. Wrong one. A long list of things that I have here to choose from. Now, in this particular options, I've only got email and mobile phone set up, but you can choose, apart from alternative email or mobile phone, you can choose a mobile app notification, you can use a mobile app code that could be sent to your mobile device, you can use your office phone if you still have landline phones, and you can choose security questions. And it's down to you as an administrator on what you think is a secure way of allowing users to reset their password and a good challenge for them to authenticate themselves. Now, just to quickly show secret questions, you can choose a user to create a set of questions. They can be up to 5, so 3, 4, or 5. And then out of those, how many questions should they be challenged with or should they face when they are trying to reset their password? Do you want them to use 3, 4, or 5? So they have 5 questions at the bank, they get 5 questions to reset, or they can then just see 3 questions to reset and log into their services. You can, however, go and look at some of these questions. There's a long list of predefined questions that you can add to the list, which might be easier to do. Or if you know you're working with a particular environment, you might want to add custom questions, and you can do so by adding in the custom questions. Now, this would allow you to create a secure mechanism of how users should be able to go and reset their passwords. And this is when they try to log into the portal and they have the option to click on reset password, and this should take them to this service that will allow them to authenticate themselves from the methods that you choose, and then they should be able to reset their password and log in to the services. Apart from resetting passwords, Microsoft provides you password protection and management capabilities in Azure environments. Now, Azure Active Directory has a feature that allows you to create secure passwords simply because it's got a list of global banned passwords that it's constantly updating as and when they know and more frequent passwords that are used around the world. Or weak passwords, passwords that are leaked, passwords that are known to be used, things like password 1, or with all sorts of variations, @signs, $signs, zeros. And if now you're thinking you need to change your password, and remember, this is a very common non-password and easier to crack for some of these malicious tools that you use. And for this very reason, Microsoft has a feature that allows you to automatically ban any of these passwords to be utilized in your environment. And it automatically ensures that any users that's trying to create a password that matches a banned list or global banned list is not allowed to do so. However, you might be aware of certain other words that can be used within your environment for passwords, and you might want to ban some of those. Now, let's quickly jump onto the portal again one more time and go back into looking at some of the details on custom passwords that you can create to ban. Now, if I go back onto my Active Directory and scroll down to security on my Active Directory Blade, Azure Active Directory Blade, and look for authentication methods under Manage, and look for password protection. Now, here I have features available like custom banned passwords. Now, these features allow me to ensure that I can enforce custom banned password list that I want to create. Why would you want to create custom banned passwords? Maybe my users are working with a project and you know that very likely people might use the name for the project. You can add the name of the project. Let's say it's called Falcon 1, and you can add that word. Maybe your org name, which you think people might type in their organization name, and you can add that to the list. What this does is ensures that all the variations of these words that you're typing in, it wouldn't allow people to use this as secure password unless they added other things to that, and not just you leave that as that word and ensure that their password is secure. Now, another amazing part of this particular tool is that it can be then replicated or forced to be pushed out to your Azure, to your Active Directory that sits on your premises. So by simply enabling this feature, you can allow it to sync with your services that are running on premises and in a hybrid environment to ensure that these passwords or custom banned passwords are also not allowed within your premises environment. Let's look at lesson number 3. Here we are going to explore access management capabilities of Azure. Now, within this module, we'll talk more about conditional access and its benefits, and we'll look at what are Azure Active Directory roles and how they differ from role-based access control, or in short, RBAC. Let's start talking about conditional access. What is conditional access? Now, if you consider the word conditional access, maybe it tells you that it is giving someone access based on some conditions. And that's exactly right. We're talking about allowing people access based on their different conditions. In this case, we'll talk about something referred as signals. When users are logging in, their incoming data can be looked at different input or different signals that are coming in. For example, I'm a user that's based in a particular location, so I might be generating signals of the user logging in from a location. I might be using my work device that's been given to me or assigned to me. Or I might be using my own device, so bring my own device option so it knows what device I'm using. So every time I log in from my work laptop to my personal laptop, that's generating different signals, so different incoming messages for my services to understand how to control my data. Similarly, it can be many of the variations of incoming signals. There's a list of them mentioned on the screen that you can look at. Now, consider conditional access as if and then statements. Now, if you're not a developer, surely that should be easy to understand. If something, then allow them or deny them, or do something based on their incoming signals. So that's what we are going to look at in case of conditional access. Now let me use a very quick example to explain some of this. Assume I'm logged into my laptop, sitting in my office, and I'm trying to access some of my resources. Let's assume some data that sits in Azure. My manager sends me an email, says, Waleed, can you log into this and go make a change to this data? Now, I'm logging in still from my office, still using my work laptop, and the conditional access here looks at my incoming signals and says, you know what, that's perfectly okay. Let's allow access to this data, and I should be able to log in and make changes. Now, I've finished the work for the day. I've left my office and I've gone home, and my manager rings me and says, the change that we made to the data wasn't supposed to happen until tomorrow morning. Can you revert that change? I can log back into my device, but this time I'm logging in from a different location. So the incoming signals can see that it's the same user, but it's logging in from not far. I'm hoping that I don't live far from my office, so I'm not far from the location that originally was. So it understands, maybe same country, at least same city, that I'm logging into the service. So it understands, okay, not much has changed, but it's not in the same physical location, still using my laptop to log in. In this case, what it can do, it can suggest, maybe confirm it to you by challenging my login or my request by asking me to do multi-factor authentication. Once I successfully provide the details, I might be allowed in and I can log into my data and make that changes or make that change. Now let's assume I've traveled abroad to a different country far away from my hometown, and I am now working in my office from a different country. Now, while I'm trying to log into my data services, let's assume I am in UK at the moment and I'm going to travel to US. Now we know there are different laws that governs data in UK and in US. So maybe there is a policy that suggests that users only in UK are allowed to access this particular data because it's collected from the clients that are based in UK. So if now I am logging into the same user, logging in from a complete different location, so I'm going to US instead of where I was before, this case my if has changed, but then would simply in this case will say, sorry, you should not be accessing this data because you're not in the same location as allowed to access this data. So it will simply block my access to this particular service. Now, this is conditional access and how it looks like. Now, let's quickly have a look at conditional access on our portal. Okay, let's go back onto our security tab under Active Directory. In fact, let's just go back so we know where we exactly are. So looking at Azure Active Directory Blade, and if I scroll down, looking at security tab over here, so going into security and looking at conditional access. Now, conditional access, there are a couple of policies that I have. They're both switched off. I can simply go and look at these policies or create a new one. Doesn't really make a difference. Let's have a look at creating a new policy. Let's call this location, since we were talking about locations, and let's say deny. Just to make sure that I am creating a right policy, because if you don't name them appropriately, you might have 10 different policies and you wouldn't know what to go and amend, and it might take a bit longer. So appropriate names is always useful. I get to choose on who this policy applies to. I have options to choose individual users. I can go by all users. I can select groups of users, and in this case I can decide if it's just the guests or external users, so I can put them all in one category. I can go back into roles. I can say anyone that has a particular role, maybe all the admin groups, maybe contributor roles, any other roles that I have, I can assign this to them, or I can simply go and choose individual users and groups to assign this policy to. Now let's put Alex and assume we're applying this policy to just Alex. All right, let's add Alex as a single user to have this policy applied to. Now, I do have options to exclude people. So if you were adding everyone or an entire group and you want to exclude a particular user for whatever reasons that you may have, you can go and exclude them from choosing the exclude option. Now, if I move on to the next option I have, we're looking at Cloud App Actions, and here we can choose what actions we want to happen for this user. Now, in this case, let's choose selected apps. I don't want it to be applied on all apps, and I've got a list of things. Maybe when this user is logging onto Office portal, this particular policy applies to them. Or I can simply go and type in Azure, and it should come up with Azure credentials and details. Maybe I want them to do this whenever they're logging into Azure management portals to manage anything within Azure environment. So every time they do that, they will be, this policy applies to that particular user. So let's select that. Now remember, if I am going to set up conditions in this case of what this policy should filter down to, there are loads of different options available for me to look at over here. I'm not necessarily going to go through all of them, but since in my example we're talking about location, we can choose different locations. In this case, I can say this particular user, if Alex logs in from trusted sites from a particular location or any location, this policy applies to Alex. Now, since Alex is using is going to go into Azure management portals, I want to apply this policy to Alex regardless of where Alex logs in from. And you do have other options to look at, and we'll discuss some of these options a bit later on in security options to allow users to sign in. Now, apart from that, now this was the if part of my conditional access. Let's have a look at the second part, which is what happens if this policy is met for Alex so far. I can simply block Alex's access to the service, or I can grant Alex access and allow Alex to do other things like require multi-factor authentication. or require a password change. Not necessarily want to do that every single time Alex logs into Azure, but again, as a feature to look at. So I can choose some of that. And again, I have options to apply all the options I choose, or maybe one of those to allow to work. So I require one of the selected controls. And I select. Now, I have an option to turn this policy on or off, or report only. In this case, it will simply monitor it. It won't making changes, but it will record information of what's happening, or I can simply switch it on and then it will enforce this policy out to everyone, or in this case Alex, in my Active Directory. So I can click on create and it will go out and create that policy. Now this is how you create conditional access policies, and again, depending on what you're going to implement in terms of controlling access to your services, maybe you want to plan it better before you go ahead and create one, just like I did. Let's have a look at Azure Active Directory roles and role-based access control. Now, Azure Active Directory roles control permissions to manage resources that are within Azure Active Directory. Now, these could be resources like user accounts, looking at billing, creating new users, deleting settings. Now, these are defined by different permissions and different roles within Azure Active Directory. There's long list of pre-built user roles that are within Azure Active Directory that you can use, from things like global administrator, user administrator to manage users, billing administrators to look at billing. However, if you're not happy with the long list of built-in roles, you can create your own roles, which we refer as custom roles. Now, to do custom role or to create custom roles, you need to have a premium licensing. Now, typically, you can look at Azure Active Directory roles and categorize them in different areas. Things like Azure AD specific. Now, these might be roles that are defined specifically to allow permissions or grant permissions that can manage resources within Azure Active Directory only. Things like application administrator, group administrator, or user administrator. Again, these are defined to work within Azure Active Directory roles and manage accounts within that environment. You might look at service-specific roles. If you already have, for example, a person that's a champion in SharePoint, or someone who knows Exchange much better, instead of making them an administrator across your entire services, you might assign them a service-specific role like SharePoint administrator or Exchange administrator, for that example, Intune administrator, or many other examples similar to that. And sometimes we have services that run across different areas and you can't assign a single specific role for them. For that reason, you'll use roles that run across different areas. Things like security administrator. You require security in all sorts of products, including Azure, so you need those type of roles that can run across different services, similar to compliance administrator. Now, please remember, we spoke about zero trust in module 1. We want to always ensure that we allow least access or privilege or least privilege access to users in all environments. So not just to make users administrators if they needed to carry out a task. At a quick glance, if we look at the Azure portal one more time, and I am back into my Azure Active Directory blade, and if I scroll down to looking at roles and administrators, then I can see there are pre-built roles. There's a long list of these pre-built roles that is available for me to choose from. Now, however, if I'm not happy, like I said, obviously if you want to find one of them, you can start typing in, let's say, user administrator, and if I try user, it will start showing me anything that matches that, and I have user administrator option here. I can find out more about what this user can do by looking into, or this role can do, by looking at details that are provided, and tells me can manage all aspects of users and groups, including resetting passwords and limited admin rights. Now, again, you can find out more details about this going into it and finding out what this role exactly can and can't do. If I wanted to create a custom role, I can click on New Custom Role, and then I can start defining a new custom role if I wasn't already happy with a long list of options that I have already given to me in the built-in options. Right. Now, apart from talking about Azure Active Directory roles, we wanted to talk about role-based access control. Now, what is the difference between the two? Azure Active Directory roles are specifically designed for resources that are limited or designed to work with Azure Active Directory, whereas role-based access control is designed to work with resources that are within Azure environments. You can implement similar permissions or access rights to users at all different levels within your Azure resources. Now, if I jump onto one of my portals quickly and jump and have a look at my resources, I can assign this from a different hierarchical structure within Azure, looking from the management groups to subscriptions, going down to resource groups and resource types that I have. I can apply the RBAC at any stage. So if I start looking at, for example, subscriptions, and click on my subscriptions and choose one of the subscriptions that I have, I'll see an option within the subscription blade that refers to itself as access control, or IAM. That's identity access management. So I can go into one of these and look at what's been already assigned to me already, or I can go and click on add assignment, and here I can assign different roles to users that can access this service. Now remember, like I said, this is something that you can apply at different levels, so they will inherit these roles as if you apply to a subscription. Anything within that subscription will inherit this role. Now if I go back out, I mentioned you can go into resource groups and apply this. Let's go into one of my resource groups and look at IAM again within my resource group blade. Remember, this time I am in a resource group blade, and I am looking at IAM again, and again I have the same menus to click on and add assignments and roles. Now typically you'll get to see 3 key roles that are usually available in RBAC, which is an owner role, which is assigned to someone who creates a resource, a creator owner role. Now you can do everything when you have this role assigned to yourself or when you create something. You can, however, assign a contributor role to someone else who you want to collaborate with and work with. The only thing that a contributor can't do is assign permissions. So they can't remove or edit their own permissions or assign permissions to other. And finally, you have reader role, which simply is allowed to log in and read the service and not make any changes or modification to the resource type that you're looking at or what you have assigned the role to. Now, other roles can be specific to the service that you're looking at. In this particular case, I'm in a resource group, so maybe more resource group type roles are highlighted above. If I was looking at a particular service, for example, I'm looking at SQL, I can type that in and it'll give me more SQL related roles available for me to assign to a particular service that I want to look at. Now this doesn't just limit itself to a resource group. If I go within a resource group and pick up one of the resource types, let's assume I'll pick up a virtual machine. That's a resource type I have, and within that, again, now remember I am in the virtual machine blade and I still have access control over here, which will allow me to add role-based access control on this particular resource. So you use RBAC roles to manage your resources within Azure environment. Let's look at lesson number 4. In this, we're going to talk about identity protection and governance capabilities in Azure Active Directory. Now, within this lesson, we'll talk about identity governance capabilities, and we'll talk about what is PIM, Privileged Identity Management, and finally talk about the capabilities of Azure AD Identity Protection. Let's start talking about identity governance in Azure Active Directory. Now, we can look at understanding an identity lifecycle to understand how Azure can help you in managing identity or governing an identity within Azure Active Directory. Typically, when you start a new role, you would probably be assigned a new job role and allowed some permission to access some of the things that you require within your work environment. Now, with any role, as you progress within your job, as you move on to working with different projects, you might be your role might change and you might be assigned different rights and permissions and given access to different services. And that's where a natural progression of your job role will happen, and you'll keep on moving within the organization. Now, hopefully, if you stick to the same organization for long enough, you might retire, or even before you retire, you might decide to move to a different organization, and you might decide to leave at some point. Now, this is a natural life cycle of an identity that you'll see in an environment. Now, what we want to do as we move along within your organization from the journey of the user from starting up, so you create a new user account with very basic and limited access provided to that user. As and when the user requires more access to different services, you keep on adding that access to or for that user. Now, this ties in very nicely with the access lifecycle management as well, where you need to ensure that you're providing the user enough access to carry out their task. Again, limiting yourself to just enough access rather than giving them all access to different environments they move into, and ensuring that they can still carry out their jobs and complete the task. Once the employee decides to leave, you can then start removing their access to different services, and hopefully they'll have no access assigned to their services or to all the services that you have within your environment. So that's a natural progression within a life cycle of an identity, along with the access life cycle they would have been assigned to the user. Now, as they go along or throughout the journey within the organization, you also want to ensure that the users are not given rights or access more than they require. So, for instance, if I have naturally moved from one job position to another, maybe I've become a senior member of management team, I might be assigned some additional rights as I move into a different role. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that I need to be given an administrative right for everything that's within the organization, and the rights that are provided to me or given to me should not be more than what I need to do my day-to-day tasks. If I require at a certain point in time to carry out a task that requires an administrative task, that can also be managed by giving me or elevating my particular rights and access for the time period for me to carry out that task. So that is something that you can manage and understand how you should securely manage and administer your accounts within your environment. Now, Azure Active Directory has some features that can allow to ease your work in terms of managing how these accounts can look like. We can start talking about entitlement management. Now, this allows you to make it easier for your organizations to assign different predefined settings and access to different roles and users. For instance, I'm sure this has happened to some of us, where when we join into a new organization, for the first week or two, or maybe longer, we don't necessarily know what services we need access to, what system that organization necessarily has, and who do I need to go and contact to get access to that particular service. As we get comfortable with the role, we might start looking at understanding the flow of a business properly, asking people, contacting the right person to allocate you access and let you carry on working with tasks. With entitlement management, this becomes easier, where you can simply go into looking at creating a package which can simply be assigned to a new role, and within that package they might be given different services. Now, if I quickly jump back onto my portal and go back into Azure Active Directory one more time, and go down to Identity Governance. Now, I can see I have entitlement management over here. Try that one more time. There we go. So entitlement management over here. So what we want to do is we want to click on packages. Now, there's a lot more detail to it, but we'll keep this conversation limited to what we want to look at and not necessarily how to create them. In this case, I already have a predefined package there that's called Sales and Marketing. So if I had a new member of staff that's joining as part of Sales and Marketing, you could assign this to them straight away. Now, what this has in store for me, it tells me that who created this particular group, when it was created, and some of the details about it, and then some important information over here to see that I can see it's got one group already added and team. You have access to 2 apps with this particular service, and you can get into one SharePoint site if this package was added to some a user. Now, again, It's predefined, so it makes it easier for a user's journey when they're joining into an organization. As long as you know what team they sit within, you assign a package that's pre-built with different policies and different settings, so they can simply go in and look at different things in their role. Now, apart from that, we do have something called access review. Now, access reviews are interesting to look at simply because we want to make sure that you're not allowing loads of different users to go into different services and leave their rights or accounts with administrative rights left alone. For example, I might have a department that might have 10 different user administrators assigned to it. Do I necessarily need that many administrators looking at that particular department? Maybe not. Access management or access reviews can help me going into that and reviewing different accounts to understand if I have given someone a privilege or account access to look at, do they still need that access? Do I need to control and manage access to different users that are provided, and how and what they're doing with that access that's been provided to them? It allows me to efficiently manage different groups and users within an environment, so I can observe different users with different rights accessing different services, and I can monitor some of that. We also have something called terms of use. Now, if I go back onto the portal and scroll down within the same menu, look at terms of use, which is in the bottom, almost near the bottom of the screen, and I can see terms of use. Now, typically you get to see terms of use when you go and sign up for something. Why would we need terms of use in Azure Active Directory? Now, this can be useful for many different reasons. Maybe you have a particular area within your organization, part of your SharePoint site has sensitive information. Maybe it is for a particular project, particular clients, or it's just internal information and kept for just your clients or your internal staff. For whatever reason, you might want to remind users who have access to this site to ensure that they are entering a secure area and they don't breach any of your internal policies or any policies that you've implemented. You might want to create an environment where they can be then given a file to refer back onto the internal company policies that you can attach onto this, and here we go, we can upload a required document in this space, which they can see as soon as they try to click onto the SharePoint site, for instance, and they might be reminded that they need to read that policy. A lot of the time we see the policy, we skip it most of the time, hopefully not all of us, and we simply click next to carry on with the process that we need. Now, you can enforce some other options over here where users have to expand all the options that are available for them. When do they need to tick on this? Do they need to do it every day? Do they do it from every device they log in? And different options that you can implement within that to ensure that you're reminding users one more time to ensure they are getting into a secure area, or maybe working with a product or project that is still kept confidential, or any other policy that you want to enforce, you can use with term of use. Now, apart from that, we want to now talk about something called privilege identity management. So let's jump back onto the portal, slides, and look at privilege identity management. Now, what is privilege identity management? We have been speaking about this throughout some of the topics. As and when a user working in an environment requires to carry out a task that's not within their remit, or in terms of their user permissions, doesn't allow them to carry that task, you don't necessarily need to create that or move that user to a different role. You can simply assign them rights to carry out a particular task for you, and in that case, they can simply request to raise their privileges for that particular task, and once they're done with it, they can that particular privilege can be removed or expire after the limited time that's given to them. So a few good things to know: you are only limiting their access for JIT, or just-in-time access. So for the time period they need to carry that task. So it's time-bound. It expires within a particular time period. Typically, when you request for something like this, you can create an approval process where an administrator or a certain set of users have to approve you to carry out that task. So you can assign different members of your team or other teams to approve a task for them to carry that out. Everything that you do within PIM is auditable. You can go back and look at who requested access, who approved access, what did they do with that access, how long did they log in for, what did they carry out within this, and all this is auditable, and you can find out all that within the auditable history. Now, if I jump back onto the portal quickly, just to show some of the features that we spoke about within PIM. So I can see that within my PIM, I can quickly go into manage access. And let's have a quick overview. There we go. We can have different roles assigned, different access assigned to users. You can activate them. You can look at approving some of these, so people when they request some of these access, or you can simply go back and audit everything somebody has done. So you can control on what, which user accessed, which user requested an access, and what they did with that access. So if I had any pending requests, they will come and land within my pending request options over here, and any approved requests that I've already approved will be here. Now, typically you'll go into your audit options over here, look at my audit, and you can click on looking at everything that was available for you to look at in terms of who did what, and you can run different reports to audit different roles that were assigned or given PIM access to go and change different services. Now we want to talk about Azure Identity Protection. Now, Azure automatically protects identities and credentials that we have within Azure Active Directory. Now, it does this by using some of the features that it has built into its security mechanism for identity protection. Within this, it automatically rates different users for different or rates them based on different categories like low, medium, high, depending on their activities and what they're doing to log into different services. And based on that, it assigns each access or each attempt as a sign-in risk or a user identity risk. Now, sign-in risks typically are based on how a user has logged in differently to what they normally do to sign in. This could be a typical travel. For example, I log in from UK normal basis, and literally a few seconds later, someone from France has logged into my service. Now, the system should be able to pick that up really quickly and understand this was a typical travel. I wouldn't have traveled within 5 minutes from UK to France, which is impossible for now. And for that reason, it should be able to identify that this particular sign-in is a risky sign-in. Now, depending on how that happened, it will rate it from medium, low, medium, and high based on how somebody logged in. This could also be someone trying to log in with anonymous IP address, so hiding behind a VPN or a non-malicious IP address and trying to log into the service. So it will rate you as a risky sign-in. Now, with risky users, it might understand that the probability of someone signing in, that it is not you, and that's how it understands that this might be a risk sign-in. For users that don't necessarily log in with certain aspects, maybe you don't log in with your personal mobile phone, you don't necessarily use an app authenticator or anything like this that you might suddenly use, it might assume that you have a sign-in or risky sign-in risk that you are doing to sign into different services. Right, let's have a look at this in the portal. So if I go back onto my Azure Active Directory and scroll down to security again and look at identity protection, it should give me a good idea of if there are any risky sign-ins within my Azure Active Directory at the moment. Like I said, it rates it from low, medium, high. If I click on the medium risks that it's showing me at the moment, I can see I've got 2 users that have logged in and they might have had some issues with logging in. So again, it's showing me at risk. So if I click on Miriam and try to see why this one is particularly popped up, it can tell me a little bit about the user and who that user is and what the risk level is at the moment, and when this incident of this risk happened, and typical details about that user and department. Now, if I click on the recent sign-in or the risk that is flagged up, I can see there were 2 successful attempts and 1 was interrupted. And if I go across to see what was wrong with this, I can see this user logged in from Frankfurt. Step back 1 second, and there we go. So I can see that's this user logged in from Frankfurt, where we said they don't necessarily log in from there because they're based in the US. I can see some more details. What device did they log in? They use a Chrome, they use an Android device, and again, that kind of flagged up automatically that this is not what the normally a user does when they sign into some of these services. So again, that kind of gives you an idea on how you can how the identity protection works in the back end, picking up users when they do try to sign in, either themselves or someone else uses their identity to sign in, and you can flag them up. You typically get to see 3 reports. We do have a 4th report, which is in preview, so I'll leave that out for now. So you can use a risky users report, and you can find out users that are at risk. Risky sign-in report, that will talk to you about different sign-ins that were at risk. So assuming that the sign-ins are not performed by the users themselves, and it will show you all of that and all those attempts. And again, risk detection on when it detected a risk. So you can pull up 3 different reports in here and understand if you have users at risk. Now, when we were doing conditional access, these can then feed into conditional access as a signal coming in. Some of the conditions that we didn't look at that point was looking at risky sign-ins, risky users, and we can base some of these risks. So if a user is logging in and a system is picking them up as risky user at a medium level, maybe we can decide different things to happen. If they are high risk, low risk, we can choose different options to happen. Avoid them access, enforce further authentication. So again, these signals can be used from the identity protection to check and control their access into your environment. In this session, we explored Azure Active Directory, including identity types that Azure Active Directory supports, secure authentication methods, password protection and management capabilities, conditional access, Azure Active Directory roles, identity governance, benefit of PIM, privileged identity management, and capabilities of Azure Active Directory identity protection. This concludes Module 2. We will take a quick 10 minutes break and start back with our first segment of Module 3, capabilities of Microsoft Security Solutions for Azure. See you shortly.